This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. So, today I wanted to talk about connectivity and how we look at overall environments. We've had a very successful Grand Prairie Friends 31st annual meeting, and I'd like to use it as an example of how you get together and do things. The original intent of the Grand Prairie Friends was to provide and advocate for Prairie in the absence of such advocacy. The land is very rich, glaciated from the Laurentian Shield in Canada, and every inch is valuable for agriculture. The little remnants that remain mostly along railroad corridors and in cemeteries that have not been mown or have a reserve plots that have been native to Prairie. We do what we can to preserve these sites. They're remnant sites, as distinct from reconstruction sites. The state was originally 2/3 prairie, and in the prairie regions, a large percentage of each county was prairie. Champaign County was 94% prairie. But prairie looks like weeds. It is a weed to settlers who need to get rid of it in order to put in agriculture. And it doesn't have a lot of advocates. It was poorly drained and had to be drained by people who came from Europe and knew how to drain it, the Frieslanders and the Deutschlanders who drained places like Flatville. The Grand Prairie Friends has done very well with the prairie preservation, but then it got to be fairly difficult to preserve prairie, and there were opportunities that arose in other places to combine prairie with prairie forests, and one of those sites was in Coles County. And it's a very good example of how you get together and encourage things into action. A one-man show doesn't always work in many situations. You need 2 or 3 people in a basement with a donut. You need a team. You need a sub-team of leaders that can take environmentalists that come in support into action. There's nothing more frustrating than to have volunteers arrive and they don't have leadership. They don't know what to do, and you very quickly can lose that sort of support. Grand Prairie Friends has done very well at that. They have had leadership. Jamie Ellis has been there for 19 years, and there are board members who are not only board members, but they're also advocates, and they've preserved sites like Loda, which has a set aside for future graves that was prairie and native, and they put a 9-acre buffer zone around that, just to work with farmers and to get that sort of site, and to work with the state and to provide reserve areas for future graves. As it takes talent. There are 2 other cemetery prairies in the region that Grand Prairie Friends is very aware of, and they're nature preserves. The opportunity arose to do prairie preservation work in Coles County, and so Grand Prairie Friends moved some of their mission in that direction. The targeted areas were on the banks of the Ombra River that could not be worked for agriculture, and they probably had been cut over because that was what happened. Thankfully, those cutovers were worked in auction days when you selected a tree and snug it out. You didn't clear cut. So you have some native vegetation that still exists. It can't be agriculture except for perhaps cattle. Also, over the years, the draining of those areas and the resultant crud tree population has crept in. So you have forest with some invasive species. At that time, through donations and grant money and volunteer work and creative leadership and creative acquisition and taking of the Grand Prairie Friends to a legal trust and providing management services to working with the community and improving the site of Warbler Woods area, then that has inspired quite a lot of other interest and concern at state and even national level. Warbler Woods is just downstream from a dam that provides water for Charleston, and that has a catchment area which is also native. When you combine this with other state sites and local sites and gradual acquisition of additional areas, you have an attractive mission. It provides land enough for flora and fauna to find niches and remnant soil that is native. There was a time when there was a need to take the prairie mission to forest. And it is somewhat more interesting and traditional and supportive to move the mission to forest. You can hug a tree, you can love a tree. It's still a part of the prairie forest ecosystem. It's in big groves where the soil was drained. It might be on a riverbank, or it might be on a moraine where trees can exist without being flooded. So the mission morphed some into forest, and it's been very interesting to see how the Grand Prairie Friends has handled that. They have managed their first acquisition and given access to the public, put in parking lots and put in a building that would allow for functional activities. There's a well. The site is part of the complex that is below the Charleston Reservoir, which provides water for Charleston. You're fortunately also fairly near academia. Eastern Illinois University is at Charleston, and there is an attitudinal base which is quite positive. So to plant native trees, to replace invasive trees like honeysuckle and autumn olive, and perhaps sometimes an overgrowth of other trees that could raise something like 125 volunteers. In order to do that, you have to have leadership that knows the legality of the site. You have to know, have an associate, CEO, a person in charge of putting things together. You have to have donations and grant money and volunteers. And you have to have concepts. You have to have dreams. So bat preservation has been a dream. And just so we have a site that now coalesces quite a lot of other real estate. And people watching who have private sites welcome this, because the effective management of the area allows people to, with private ownership of natural areas that are nearby, to think that perhaps this natural area would be better incorporated into the complex, so that not only Grand Prairie Friends will watch, but the state, and that the management would be such that flora and fauna would gather opportunities to find niches, to reconstruct the nature that was there. The soil is often fairly native. There are fingers of agriculture that moved into the forest, and those are being converted back to prairie. It will be a reconstruction prairie, not a remnant prairie, but give it 100 years and that sort of site can be back, and some of the bacteria and microorganisms that are in the soil, a wonderful array of organisms, can gradually come back. So the prairie within 5 years will look like a prairie and act like a prairie, and gradually you'll be able to infuse the rough, tough plants, and then gradually the more sophisticated plants that need care. You also have to know that there's an overpopulation of deer, and if you are going to put in sophisticated plants, you have to know that animals know what a legume is and enjoy its nutrition. So you have to be concerned about this sort of overpopulation of deer, to the point that they used to glean behind harvest equipment that was not as efficient as it is today. So huge populations of deer can get to be starving, and then they take on disease, and they can devastate your work as an agency. The creation of this complex is important, and it's allowed Grand Prairie Friends to establish themselves as a trust. They now have over 1,000 acres of ground in the area, and the overall complex, including the dam, must be more like 2,000 acres. So you have a complex. That's enabled the Grand Prairie Friends to belong to other organizations like the Prairie State Conservation Coalition that is concerned about legalities for open space, natural areas, and so there is a need for lobbying to the state legislature to protect these areas, to provide taxation bases that are positive, and that's a plus that encourages nearby neighbors to contribute their sites for management of not only the flora and fauna, but the way the sites are used with trails. David's just come in.
Yep, sorry.
Now I want you to dream. When you're doing these sorts of things, they're not typical. You are concerned with people who have ideas, and the question is how to work with them. In the case of Warbler Woods, you have an ideal setting, and one that has been taken advantage of very, very well, and still continues, and there's dreams to increase the membership of Grand Prairie Friends, probably to even double the membership. At the meeting they had on just a little while ago, there was at least 200 people, and so to multiply that, you need a certain structure. First of all, you need a dream. You need to know that the state was 2/3 prairie, and that needs to be. So you're looking at a world ecosystem, and it's unique and it's endangered. Every inch is more or less in agriculture. So we need to preserve the prairie. There are other sites that are much more vulnerable than the site at Coles County. We have just lost, in the last year or so, about 35 miles between Oakland and Hinesboro and Arcola and Arthur and Lovington through to Decatur. That site was set up as a potential trail, but 11 sites had already been sold because it took a long time for the idea to gel. Some of these ideas take 20 years, sometimes they take more than that. Sometimes, if you're lucky, something wonderful will happen and it will fall into your hands. But that, with the loss of that 100-foot wide corridor with a narrow rail bed in the middle and prairie soils on either side and prairie plants and prairie creatures. It's a very narrow corridor, not really representative of something like 10,000 acres of prairie. But it's what we have left and what we have to work with. It's also depauperate in the fact that it has been invaded by trees and plants and creatures that reduce the originality of the prairie. So, as I dream, and as I hope Grand Prairie Friends dreams, we look at other sites that are not quite so easy to acquire. So we lose that one site. We also lose sites that have been reconstruction prairies. Sarah Livesey, who is the CEO for Grand Prairie Friends, went to visit a prairie site that her father had maintained, and lo and behold, it had been destroyed and something else was there. So even though we work at this, we don't always succeed. At the moment, there is the possibility of expansion in some places. That came up as Grand Prairie Friends invited Wendy Garrison in to be here. She got a biology degree here, met her husband here. He got a job in Mississippi where he grew up, and Wendy has been out of the area for 30 years. She was fundamental in working with the establishment of Grand Prairie Friends. She helped provide the money to buy 1 mile of prairie in the Gifford area. So now it just is a lot of fun to have people walking that corridor. There's just about 6 of us, and the debate back and forth was interesting. One of the debates was regarding a possible caboose. Could you look at this 1 mile of abandoned railroad bed and relate it to the rural sociology of growing up in this area? Where did the settlers come from? How did they get here? First of all, they came by river, and they came from the south and from the north. So there's history here. There's stories. Most of the stories are verbal, because there was no time to archive and to record early settlement development. You had to drain. You had to get rid of this prairie sod with its deep roots. You had to find your way around. Many people died not finding their way around in the prairie because there was no indication of what was north and south until they discovered a compass plant which turned its leaves north and south in order to avoid summer suns. You have to know the climate. The climate traditionally has been spring rain, summer drought, fall rain. And so the prairie is very adapted to being wet at some stages and very dry at others. And the compass plant had a deep root, so sometimes if we dig a compass plant up, the top 2 feet will weigh 45 pounds, and the crown will be 10 inches across, and the fruiting body will be 8 and 10 feet tall. and the stems will be tough and hairy to prevent the wind from drying them out. So the chemistry is that it is a lot of rosin there that helps to preserve the dignity of the plant. The leaves are invaginated so that there's fewer breathing pores. The settler could climb on a horse and look for this plant, and that gave him north and south. Okay, so we have not only an ecosystem to worry about, but we have the stories of the past and possibly the stories of the future. What will we do to preserve this sort of corridor? So I want to look at the area around the shortline prairie, just 1 mile of halfway decent prairie soils, some trees, walnut trees, and some rolling territory, just enough of a little hill to have a cutting go through it so that a railroad wouldn't have to go up and down a small rise. If you have a long freight train, that can be a problem. So it has character. And so now we look to the Grand Prairie Friends example in the Charleston area or Coles County, and elsewhere too, Loder, and they also rent some railroad right-of-way areas. So you first of all need an overall complex, a dream for the world's ecology. And in that framework, you then need regional space. You need to know that the prairie is unique in that worldwide ecology. So once you do that, you are looking for various places. It might be someone with just a quarter of an acre of prairie in an old cemetery, or a roadside, and often it's very different from the traditional handling of those sites. A cemetery can be a target for mowing, because how can you have a cemetery that's dignified by prairie rather than by the people in the graves that are there? So you can have big meetings about whether a prairie cemetery set aside should be preserved or mown. So we're looking at a very small piece of prairie, and it's not the size of the Warbler Woods in Charleston. It's a very minor piece of corridor. It's the sort of area that is cherished by farmers as potential agriculture. If it's 100 feet wide, which is typical, it's 12 acres of ground. If it's 69 feet wide, it's 8 acres. So with a lot of fun and back and forth, we're discussing the place of this particular outlier in the region. So I like to run through some of the things that are nearby. First of all, you have a moraine, the Bloomington Moraine, and it's settled early on by Irish people in Penfield and Gifford, and they were on the well-drained hills that could be settled. On the lowlands, there were Frieslanders and Deutschlanders who knew how to drain, and they tend to be a little less on the gambling and the gaming side of Irish people, and so they have tended to move up onto the moraine, and so now you're looking at it, towns that are part Germanic and part Irish. You're looking at Gifford that has had a huge tornado through the town and devastated it. We look at the spot between the short line Prairie and the elevator, which hasn't been used, and you hope that perhaps there might be a way of connecting to Gifford. The question then is, does Gifford have parks of its own? Would this be a park? Would this allow people to have access to the prairie? Do you mow the ballast so people could have access, or do you allow that ballast to grow? Prairie, it's gravelly and can take on drier species. So there, in my dream, I would dream of an extension of that corridor into Gifford. And then you start to look around to see what else is here. You're very near a forest preserve. If you go to Penfield and go north, there is a forest preserve, and it's on the area of wetland that comes through from Ford County, through the northeast corner of Vermilion County, and eventually into the Vermilion River and the Wabash, and out to the Gulf in the long run. So there's connectivity there. There's Dillsburg, and the elevator is there, and it's on the moraine, and it's high, and it has character. We had hoped to retain the Pumpkin Vine abandoned railroad into Rantoul, but Rantoul did get 3 miles of that corridor, and it's a very, very well used urban trail. We have to look at trails versus preservation. George Fell, who created the Nature Conservancy, came back to Illinois and was creating a forest preserve. And the legislature wanted to include in the forest preserve more recreation than it was designed to have. So if you have a forest preserve, it has more right to have a wide trail and recreation. So if you're looking at a little short line prairie, you're looking at mowing, not regrowing. So how do we look at other sites? Just a mile or so further east is Penfield. A lot of the land between Penfield and Fithian and then further north were owned by an early doctor. There were yards for cattle. There was an elevator. And that line went on to Armstrong and Potomac and through to Indiana. The land gets to be more rambunctious when it gets to be the Vermilion River. And underneath, you have to know that geology has faults and coal that has accumulated in the Carboniferous era. So it becomes more interesting once you go a little east. So that adds to your understanding of the landscape. At Gifford, you're on the top of a moraine. It's a little more windy, so there are wind vanes. There, and you're in a territory where people are generating their own power. You're also on the top of the moraine, which has a slope on the advanced side where melting snow would run into outwash plains, creeks, and give that swampland that was native to Flatville. There's a railroad from Penfield that goes down through Penfield and through Daly and heads towards east of St. Joe, and it's the Union Pacific Railroad now. But there are stories. There's a time when it was very snowy and a train was parked at Penfield, but apparently it didn't have brake capacity that was needed, and it's gradually moved down at its own power down the slope of the moraine. Well, if you take that road, you know that you're going down a moraine. Your ears don't necessarily pop because it's that much of a altitude change, but you do get the notion of what a moraine and outwash plain is. A little in this sort of rambunctious area, there's first of all a high school, and the Forest Preserve had given access to a tractor company that where volunteers bring in their antique tractors, and it was on Forest Preserve territory a little to the north of Penfield. But there was some debate about compaction of soils and things like that. And so the tractor company took over a high school, and instead of destroying the high school, they use it as their museum. And so there's a little bit of a different history. There's even places where you can plow or demonstrate your equipment. And there's a very good attendance at annual tractor fairs, and I'm forgetting the name of the organization, but it's there. Just a little further to the east, there's a lowlands, flatlands. The Pumpkin Vine Railroad used to go under the main line that comes through Daly this day. So there were crossings of railroads, and different railroads had their own lines, and they charged a lot for other lines that might want to use double use two different companies on the same line. It's always been a challenge and often competition. And let's turn around and go west. There are some nice rolling hills. Gordyville is an auction site and event site on the hill that can handle a lot of people. It is right near where the Pumpkin Vine Railroad used to go through. It's near to Dillsburg. Dillsburg has had a railroad, Fisher Grain and Coal Company, and it was retired about 3 years ago. There are elevators there. The railroad bed has gone back mainly to agriculture. But for years, we were digging up prairie plants in modern cornfields that were on the railroad right-of-way. In our dreams, we thought that that corridor could be an interesting preservation site, and not so much a recreation site, but it could also be a trail. George Fell, going back to the Nature Conservancy, had a lot to do with taking on another type of conservation unit, which is a conservation district. So locally we have a forest preserve which has got a little more right to deal with recreation, and a preservation site which is the Vermilion County Conservation District. If we go further west, 8 Mile of this old Pumpkin Vine line has been acquired by Fisher Grain and Coal Company, which has now changed its name, but it still provides grain for the coalition of cars from a couple of districts, so that you can provide the Canadian National Railroad with at least 125 cars, which is sort of the efficient use of the railroad mainline. So Fisher Grain and Coal Company has an engine of its own, and it brings out its grain to Rantoul, and it did own the line from Rantoul east to Dillsburg and Gifford and Penfield. So we're looking at these areas and trying to figure out what relates to what. There's an 80 acres of territory that belongs to the retired Chinook Air Force Base. That is in rough and tough prairie. There is a 9-acre site just west of Rantoul, or south of Rantoul, which is an old landfill, and it has grown over to locust trees, especially, and the landfill is fairly rugged, not much topsoil. It has buried 60 feet down newspapers that you can still read, because there hasn't been a lot of water there and organisms to allow them to digest. You have some sort of relationship to Champaign-Urbana. There was an interurban that went from Urbana to Rantoul and up to Kankakee. So that is something that you look at and dream. It's not running parallel to the railroad line, the modern railroad line that is Canadian National. It was running possibly according to what the trail was at the time. Early native settlers didn't necessarily have a Jeffersonian plat in mind. It's not north, south, east, west, so that you, if you bought a plot of land sight unseen, you could find it. So trails that went through to Peoria were early Indian trails. Bloomington Road was probably an early Indian trail. So we have going back to the short line, we're still looking at what you can find if you're a tourist and you came. If you're coming from another country to find about Prairie, how would you find the geology, the sociology, the idea? People are very curious about other people, and they would like to know what is your heritage ecosystem? What have you done with it, and what will you do with it? And there are little lessons to be learned, like at Loda, the preservation site that has never been dug up is about a foot higher than the surrounding agricultural land. There's that much erosion has occurred. So we have these railroad lines. If you're up in a plain, you'll see that there are north, south, east, west railroad lines. Sometimes they go at a diagonal, but they service areas that were being cultivated after initial livestock use. Row crops like corn came in, and a horse could not go more than about 8 miles to pull grain to a railroad. So elevators and little towns that are associated with them are 5 miles apart. And often there's a small town associated with. It's often personed by people who were not necessarily landowners. They were people who worked the railroad and the elevator, and perhaps 60% of the content of those towns was a more working class of people. Sometimes farmers would come back from their farm and have a town site, but that pattern of knowing what is, and also realizing that in some cases the town was moved from where it was located originally, often close to a river, where before railroads you could come up a river, especially in flood stage, with a canoe or other river barges and settle. And so if the railroad came by at some distance, then that early settlement with its mill and its water race and early settlement would move to the railroad. At Atwood, we have a site that was at the junction of 2 rivers, and when the railroad came through to the south, the town moved to the railroad, and so the term Atwood would mean that, that settler is at the woods. That's the early settlement, rather than at the railroad, which was named Atwood. Going back to the short line, you go a little south and you get to Wells Cemetery, and it has a little plot of native soil and prairie. Elizabeth Hanson and her husband spent a lot of time. They had relatives in this general area, buried in various funereal places, and they restored these areas, and the Grand Prairie Friends has acquired a grant to look at cemetery prairies. That could be one. So again, we're getting wider and wider. We have a potential rail trail between Bloomington and Mansfield, which is sort of not getting right into Champaign, but it's a potential, and if made wide, it will take out a lot of our only remaining prairie. There's a Route 150 that parallels the railroad and the abandoned railroad, and if that is widened, guess where it'll be widened? It'll be widened out of the prairie. So we need the people who dream to look at increasingly wider areas. It might be that we look at Illinois in comparison to Iowa doesn't have a Shawnee forest. Its only heritage is prairie, and so it has university sympathy to prairie. The University of Northern Iowa has something like 17 plots of prairie around their university area. It has a master's degree, possibly even a doctorate program that is oriented to prairie. They have Wesley Jackson, who is nearby at Salina and has been an agronomist and is interested in sustainable agriculture to compost your waste materials and put a chicken house on top and move the chicken house to another site when it's utilized in the first one. To grow plants that are prairie plants that will survive in the pattern of a wet spring, dry summer, wet fall. So we're also looking at between Kankakee and Rantoul as an interesting prairie site. The Route 45 travels parallel to the Canadian National Railroad, and you have the extra space of an abandoned interurban line, an abandoned Route 45, and we would like to dream about that corridor going north and south. And we have a Kickapoo Trail that goes east-west from Urbana to Danville, and portions of that have already been preserved with federal finance to maintain the line as a hike and bike trail, which could go back to railroad if necessary. So how do you put these together? How do you dream? Who dreams? And where do you get the leaders that come out of that initial few people that get to do things? How do you ask university extension agriculture to help to preserve the gene pool that might be what they need for a perennial soybean? We didn't have soybeans till 1936. We had to get the soybean glycine plant from other places, so that the University of Illinois has a collection of genetics that could be an opportunity to plant an edible, productive replacement for soybeans that could prevent erosion. When you plant seeds every year, you're giving the potential for sheet erosion to run soil into the rivers and eventually to the Gulf and inspire a dead zone. So we're getting fairly near the end, and I just want to remind you to think about those sites that are out of town. There's little dead cemeteries that we would like to find a preservation site. And so we thank you for listening. We would and like to encourage that little piece of prairie between the short line and Gifford. See if it could be part of the future of the Grand Prairie Friends. This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. I don't know if anyone mentioned this at the top of the show because I wasn't here. Today is Sunday, December the 1st. It's the first day of December, and you're tuned to WAFT Champaign 90.1 FM. This has been the Prairie Monk program for the first day of December. Then, as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.